The last night at Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital. There are places people abandon because they become too expensive to maintain, places they leave because they are unsafe, and then there are places that become abandoned because the people who enter them begin telling stories they cannot explain. In South Korea, one abandoned building became surrounded by exactly this kind of legend. Hidden in Gwangju, Gyeonggi-do, Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital became famous as one of the country's most frightening abandoned locations. For years, photographs of the building showed broken windows, decaying corridors, empty rooms, and walls slowly being consumed by time. But the building itself was not what made Gonjiam terrifying. It was the stories. Visitors and urban explorers claimed they heard voices coming from empty rooms, footsteps moving through deserted corridors, doors opening without explanation, and strange sounds coming from places where nobody could possibly be hiding. Some stories even claimed that people who entered the hospital experienced sudden feelings of panic, confusion, or the sensation that someone was watching them. Most of these stories were never independently verified, but that did nothing to stop the legend from growing. One cold autumn night, 6 young people decided that they were tired of hearing stories about Gonjiam and wanted to discover the truth for themselves. The group consisted of Min Jun, Jae Hyun, Seo Yun, Hyun Woo, De Eun, and Tae Sik. They had spent several days discussing the hospital online, watching photographs and reading stories posted by people who claimed to have visited the abandoned building. Jae Hyun was the one who finally suggested that they go there themselves. At first, everyone laughed at the idea, but curiosity slowly defeated common sense. They decided to meet late at night and explore the building together. Hyun-woo brought a camera so they could record everything. They joked that if nothing happened, they would at least have a frightening-looking video to upload online. None of them realized that by the end of the night, the camera would become the only witness to something none of them could explain. They arrived near the hospital shortly after midnight. The surrounding area was almost completely silent. The trees moved slightly in the wind, and beyond them stood the dark outline of the abandoned building. It looked less like a hospital and more like something that had been forgotten by the world. Several windows were broken, vegetation covered parts of the exterior, and large sections of the building disappeared into darkness. For a few moments, nobody wanted to move. Jae Hyun tried to make everyone laugh by saying that the stories were obviously exaggerated. They eventually began walking toward the structure. As they approached, Tae Sik suddenly stopped and looked toward one of the upper windows. He told the others that he thought someone had whispered his name. Everyone immediately turned toward the building, but there was nothing there. No person appeared behind the window, no light was visible, and there was no movement. They told Tae Sik that he had probably imagined it. He nodded, but he continued staring at the window for several seconds before finally following the others inside. The moment they entered the hospital, the atmosphere changed. The air felt colder than outside, and their footsteps echoed through the empty corridors. Their flashlights moved across peeling walls, broken furniture, abandoned rooms, and old objects covered in dust. Hyun-woo began filming everything, occasionally making jokes for the camera. The group tried to remain relaxed, but the deeper they walked into the building, the quieter they became. Then a strange tapping sound echoed through the corridor. Everyone stopped. A few seconds passed before it happened again. Tap. Tap. The sound seemed to be coming from a room beside them. Jae Hyun slowly opened the door, expecting to find another person hiding inside. Instead, the room was completely empty. There was only an old chair, a damaged cabinet, and dust covering the floor. Hyun-woo checked the recording and discovered something disturbing. The microphone had captured a faint whisper that none of them remembered hearing clearly at the time. When they increased the volume, the sound seemed to resemble a single word, leave. Nobody laughed after that. They continued deeper into the building despite the warning. At the end of another corridor, they discovered a door that appeared to have been closed earlier. Now it stood open. Jae Hyun asked whether anyone had touched it, but everyone denied doing so. He slowly approached and shined his flashlight inside. The room contained an old examination bed, a cracked mirror, and several damaged pieces of furniture. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed unusual. Then the door suddenly slammed shut behind them. Everyone jumped. Jae-hyun grabbed the handle and tried to pull it open, but it would not move. Hyun-woo joined him, and together they pulled harder. Still nothing. Then they heard a sound from inside the room. It was slow breathing. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. The problem was that none of them was making the sound. The breathing seemed to be coming from somewhere near the examination bed. Seo-yeon whispered that they should stop trying to open the door. Jae-hyun ignored her and pulled the handle again. This time, the door suddenly opened. The room was empty. The breathing had disappeared. Everyone stood silently in the doorway, trying to understand what had happened. Then Tae-sik noticed something on the floor. There were footprints. They looked wet, as though someone had recently walked through the room. The footprints began near the examination bed and continued toward the door. But they were facing the wrong direction. Whoever had made them appeared to have been walking toward the group. Nobody could explain where the footprints came from, and nobody wanted to stay long enough to find out. Before leaving, Seo-yeon noticed the cracked mirror. She stared at it for several seconds and suddenly stepped backward. Everyone asked what was wrong. She pointed toward the reflection. For a brief moment, the mirror appeared to show 7 people standing in the room instead of 6. The 7th figure stood behind Tae-sik. Its face could not be seen clearly, and its body appeared strangely still. Tae-sik immediately turned around, but there was nobody there. When they looked back at the mirror, the 7th figure had disappeared. They tried to convince themselves that the cracked glass and poor lighting had created an optical illusion, but the fear had already taken hold. The group decided to leave immediately. They ran through the corridors, following the path they believed would lead back to the entrance. But after several minutes, they realized something was wrong. The entrance was nowhere to be found. Instead, they had reached another corridor that none of them remembered seeing before. They turned around and discovered that the corridor behind them seemed different as well. The walls appeared narrower, and the darkness seemed deeper. Then one of their flashlights flickered and went out. Another followed. Soon the corridor was almost completely dark. Somewhere ahead, they heard a woman crying. The sound was soft at first, almost like someone quietly sobbing. Then it became louder. A voice followed the crying, asking for help. Seo-yeon wanted to answer, but Jae-hyun immediately told her not to speak. The voice came again, this time sounding much closer. "Please help me." Nobody answered. Then they heard a knock from somewhere behind them. They turned around and saw nothing. Another knock followed. Then another. Hyun-woo raised his camera and pointed it toward the darkness. Through the camera display, he noticed something that wasn't visible to the naked eye. At the far end of the corridor stood a tall figure. It was completely motionless. Nobody could see its face. Hyun-woo lowered the camera and looked directly at the corridor. There was nothing there. He raised the camera again. The figure was still visible. This time it appeared closer. He began to panic. The others looked at the screen and saw the same thing. The figure seemed to be standing farther away whenever they looked with their eyes, but through the camera it appeared to be slowly approaching. Desperate to find a way out, they climbed the stairs. Eventually they reached another floor and discovered a door marked with the number 402. Jae-hyun remembered reading an online story about that room. According to the legend, people who entered it sometimes heard a mysterious voice counting from 1 to 7. He joked nervously that they had already come this far, so they might as well see what was inside. He opened the door. The room was empty. There was a table, a chair, and an old cabinet. Nothing appeared threatening. For several seconds, everyone stood quietly. Then a voice whispered, "1." Everyone froze. A second later, the voice said. 2. Nobody knew where it was coming from. 3. The room seemed to become colder. 4. De-eun moved toward the door. 5. Jae-hyun reached for the handle. 6. Then the voice whispered. 7. Everyone stared at one another. There were only 6 people in the room. Then the counting started again, but this time the voice sounded as though it were coming from directly behind them. The door suddenly slammed shut. Someone knocked from the other side. Once. Twice. Then a third time. Hyun-woo dropped his camera, and when it hit the floor, the screen remained active. Through the display, the group saw something standing in the corner. They immediately turned toward the corner. Nothing was there. They looked at the camera again. The figure remained visible. This time it seemed to be standing behind Seo-yeon. She began screaming and turned around, but there was still nothing there. Then the camera microphone captured a distorted whisper. Not the door. Everyone stared at the screen. A second whisper followed. The window. The window was several floors above the ground, and there was no obvious way to escape through it. But when the door suddenly opened by itself, they ran. They rushed through the corridors without knowing where they were going. Nobody cared about filming anymore. Nobody cared about proving the legends were true. They only wanted to leave. Every few seconds, someone looked behind them. The strange figure never seemed to chase them. It simply appeared in the distance, watching. Whenever they looked directly at it, it seemed to disappear. Whenever they looked through the camera, it was there again. Eventually, they found the entrance. Fresh air rushed across their faces as they ran outside. They collapsed near the road, exhausted and terrified. For several minutes, nobody spoke. They had escaped the hospital. At least, that's what they believed. Hyun-woo eventually checked his camera. Most of the recording was still there. He began scrolling through the footage until he suddenly stopped. He told the others to look at the screen. The video showed them approaching the hospital earlier that night. 6 people could clearly be seen walking toward the building. But when Hyun-woo looked at their shadows, there were 7. The 7th shadow had been there from the beginning. It followed them into the hospital. It appeared in the corridor. It appeared near the examination room. It appeared outside the building. They drove away without discussing what they had seen. Nobody wanted to look back. After several minutes, Tae-sik suddenly became silent. Min-jun asked what was wrong. Tae-sik looked toward the rear window and said that he thought someone was standing on the road behind them. Everyone turned to look, but there was nobody there. Tae-sik continued staring backward. Then his expression changed completely. He whispered that the person was no longer on the road. When everyone asked where the person had gone, Tae-sik slowly turned around and looked at the back seat. The seat behind them was empty. But on the camera screen, the 7th figure was sitting there. The recording eventually ended. What happened to the 6 people afterward remains part of the fictional legend surrounding this story. The real Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital has a complicated history, and many of the supernatural stories associated with it have circulated as urban legends rather than verified events. The building itself was eventually demolished, meaning the corridors, rooms, windows, and walls that inspired so many stories no longer exist. But the legend has survived, helped in part by photographs, internet stories, and the popularity of the 2018 Korean horror film Gonjiam, Haunted Asylum. Perhaps that is what makes the story so disturbing. A building can be demolished. A hospital can disappear. A room can be destroyed. But stories have a way of surviving long after the places that created them are gone. And somewhere in the darkness of the internet, old photographs of Gonjiam continue to circulate, showing the same empty corridors and broken windows that frightened an entire generation of urban explorers. So the next time you see an abandoned building in the middle of the night, remember the legend of Gonjiam. Remember the empty corridors, the unexplained footsteps, the voices that seem to come from nowhere, and the story of the seventh shadow. And if you ever find yourself standing somewhere completely alone and hear someone quietly whisper your name from behind you, there is one thing you should remember. Sometimes, the safest thing to do is not to turn around.